In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create these 4 procedural rubber materials. And if you'd like to purchase these procedural materials, you can get them with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, and also the Blender Market. Now, because I'm creating 4 different procedural materials, I'll be breaking up this tutorial into 2 parts. So in this part, in part 1, we're going to be creating this bumpy rubber and also the smooth rubber. And then in part 2, we're going to be creating the grippy rubber and also the dotted rubber. So these 4 materials are also going to be joined together into custom node groups. So I'll show you how to join them together into these node groups so that you can easily control the look of the material. And if you purchase the procedural material, then they'll already come joined into these node groups so you can easily customize them for your project. You can also check out my ultimate Blender procedural material pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you can purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create more materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu, I went to mesh, and I just added an icosphere. And then right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I turned the subdivisions up to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round, and I shaded the object smooth. Then I scaled it down by a 0.2, and I pressed Ctrl A and just applied the scale. So that's the default size of the object. Then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects, and because I'm making 4 of them, I just stuck it up here in the corner. And if you select the camera and click right here to go to the object data properties of the camera, I turn the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom it in and make everything look a bit more flat. Now for the lighting, I added a few different area lights. So I added this area light right here, kind of shining down on the top. The power is set to 250 and I set it to disk. Then I also added this area light right here and this area light right here. So these ones are set, the shape is set to rectangle to kind of add some nice rim lights on the back, and I set the power to 80 for both of these. And then I also wanted to add some nice realistic lighting and reflections. So here on the world properties, I added in this HDRI from polyhaven.com. I'll have a link in the description if you want to download it, and I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color, you can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. Also here on the render properties, you can scroll down here and open up the film tab, and then you can just check mark the transparent button so you can't see the HDRI in the background. And then also if I go down here to the color management, I'm using AGX and very high contrast to make everything look more saturated. So I'm in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode, and I have the shader editor right over here. So I'll just click on new to add a new material, and this one I'll just call Bumpy Rubber. And then also I'll be using the Node Wrangler add-on in the video, so you can click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and then over here on the add-ons tab, just search for node and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So to start making the bumpy rubber, we want to create a texture with some little dots. So to do this, I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. We'll drop it here, and I'll hold down the Control and Shift key and select the Voronoi texture. And then I can turn up this scale, and I'm going to turn the scale up to a really big number of 800. And now if I zoom in here, you can see there's a bunch of little dots. Now with the Voronoi texture selected, I'll press Control T. That's using the feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add the texture coordinate mapping. And I'm going to put the object into the vector because the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. Now I also want to distort this texture with a noise texture. So in between the mapping and the Voronoi, I'm going to search for a noise texture and put it in between these 2 nodes. Now you can see it's distorting it a lot, and we're going to change that later. But first, let's change the noise settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to 30, and I'll turn the detail up to 10 so it is more detailed, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now if I zoom in really close, you can see it's really distorted, but I want it to be less distorted, so let's go to the add menu. We're going to search for a mix color, and we'll put this between the noise and the Voronoi. Now what we're going to do is unplug the noise, and we're going to take the factor and we're going to put that into color B, and then we're going to take the mapping vector and put that into color A. Now this factor here is going to blend between distorting it less or distorting it more, but you can see the texture is moving around a lot. So let's click on the mix type here, and we're going to change it to linear light, and that way as I drag the factor, it's still distorting it, but it's not moving it around so much. So then I'm going to turn this to a really small number of 0.01, and that way if I zoom in here, you can still see it mostly just looks like that Voronoi dots texture, but it looks kind of noisy. Now if I Control Shift select the principled shader, let's do a few things to the principled shader. So I'm going to leave the roughness at 0.5, but you can change this if you want to, and then I'm going to make the base color really dark. And the hex value that I'll be using for this base color here, this is going to be a really dark brown color, and the hex value is going to be 0D0702 FF. So now I want this Voronoi texture to be going into the normal to make it look kind of bumpy. So we're going to take the Voronoi distance and let's put that into the normal, but then we need to convert this to proper normal data. So I'm going to search for a bump node, and we'll put the bump node between the Voronoi and the principled shader, and the distance is going to go into the height value of the bump. So now if I zoom in here close to the material, you can see it looks really bumpy. Now I want to control the contrast of the bumps. So we're going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to put the color ramp between the Voronoi and the bump. And now I can drag the black tab and drag the white tab, and you can see now the dots are going to be smaller. And I'm actually going to flip both of these. So I'm going to put the white tab kind of to about here, and then I'll put the black tab over to about here. So now if I zoom in closely, you can see there's just a bunch of little dots. And then later on, when we create the custom node group, I want to be able to change the size of the dots. So I can just search for a hue saturation value, and we'll put this after the Voronoi. Now the value here, I can drag this up and down, and that's going to make the texture lighter and darker. So that's controlling the size of each individual dot. So now if I zoom out, you can see it's way too strong. So let's take the bump strength and I'll turn that to a small number of like a 0.2. So now you can see it just looks like this subtle bumpy rubber. Now I also want to add a noise texture just to give it a little bit of noise over the surface. So we'll search for a noise texture, and I can just drop the noise texture right up here above the linear light. And we can take the mapping vector and put that into the vector so it's using the object coordinates. Let's Control-Shift select the noise texture, preview it, and I'll change the settings. So I'll turn the scale up to 40 so it's larger, and I'll turn the detail to 10, and then I'll turn this roughness up a little bit to a 0.6. So now it's kind of detailed. So I now want to put this noise texture into the bump as well. So we'll drag these nodes back, and we're going to take the bump node and we'll duplicate it and drop it here after the first one. So the normal is going to the normal, but we now have an extra height value that we can add data into. So let's take the noise texture factor, and I can put that into the height value, and then we'll Control-Shift select the principled shader. So now it looks way too bumpy because it's super noisy. So I want to turn the bump strength down quite a bit. So I'm going to turn the bump strength to a 0.05. So now it's very subtle, but you can turn that up more if you want to, but I want to keep it pretty subtle. So that's it for the procedural material. So to join it together into a custom node group, we can click and drag and box select all the nodes, but I don't want to select the material output. So drag and select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Ctrl-G to join it together into a node group. I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group, and I'm going to drag the node group here next to the material output, and let's make it bigger. And I can copy the material name and paste it here in the node group, so it's called Bumpy Rubber. And I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. And right here on the group tab, we have the group sockets, and I'm going to double click on the BSDF, and I'll rename it to shader because I like that better. So you can see now it's called shader. So we'll go back into the node group. Now over here on this side, we have this group input, and we can plug vise up to the group input to control them outside the node group. Now this mapping is plugged up to all the textures, so the scale value is going to control the size of the entire material. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket, and then if I click on the scale, I don't want it to be 3 values, I just want it to be 1 value instead. So we're going to take the type here and we're going to change it to float. And then here on the default value, we'll turn this to 1. And then if we go outside the node group, we want to turn this scale value back to 1. So that will change the size of the entire material. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the size of each individual dot. So if I drag the group input right up here, we have this value, and that's going to change the size of each individual dot because it's changing the brightness and darkness of the texture. So we're going to put the value into the extra socket. Let's double click on this to rename it, and we'll rename this to dot's individual size. Then let's also drag this over here next to the principled shader, and I want to put the base color and the roughness both into the extra sockets. Then I want to control the dot scale and the dot's detail, so we'll drag the group input right down here next to this Voronoi, and we can put the scale into the extra socket and also the detail. And then click and drag down here to make this bigger, and let's rename this. So I'm going to rename this to dot scale, and then also dots detail. Now I also want to control the noise scale and the noise detail, so I'll drag the group input right up here, and we'll put the noise scale into the extra socket and also the detail. Let's drag this down to make it bigger, and I'll just rename this to noise scale and then also noise detail. Then I want to control the distortion, so we'll take this linear light here, and this linear light has a factor, and that's kind of distorting the texture. So we'll put the factor into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to distortion. And then finally, I want to control the bump strengths, so we'll drag this right down here next to the bump. And the first one that we have is the dots bump strength, so we'll put that into the extra socket. And then the second one here, that is the noise bump strength. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket. And then I'll rename this, so dots bump strength. And then the second one here, this is going to be noise bump strength. I'll hit the N key to close the side panel. Let's drag the group input right back here, and I'll hit tab to go outside the node group. And now we can just review the final material to make sure everything's working correctly. So we have the overall size of the entire material. So you can change this depending on the size of your object. Then if I zoom in here, we have the dots individual size, so I can make them smaller or make them quite big until they overlap. Then we also have the base color, but since this is rubber, I'm leaving it at a really dark color. We also have the roughness of the rubber, and then we just have the dot scale, and then we just have the dots detail. Then we have the noise scale and the noise detail. Then we also have this distortion value if you want to make it more distorted, or if you turn the distortion down to 0, the dots are less distorted and they're a lot more round and consistent. And then there's also the dots bump strength, and then also the noise bump strength. So that is it for the first material. So we'll now create the second material in this video. So now let's create the next rubber material, which is the smooth rubber. So I'm just going to duplicate this object, and I'll just bring it over here, bring it along the x-axis, and then I'm going to delete the material, and we're going to add a new material, and we're going to call this one smooth rubber. Let's go into the rendered viewport mode, and then just to make the viewport a little bit faster, I'm just going to select the other object and hit H to hide it, just so the view doesn't have to render it. I'm going to zoom into this object here, which has the smooth rubber. So let's start by going to the add menu. We're going to add a noise texture, and let's preview the noise texture. And then also with the noise texture selected, I'll hit Control T to add the texture coordinate mapping, and I want to use the object, so we'll put the object into the vector. And then also I like to keep my nodes nicely organized, so I'm going to box select these two nodes. I'll hit Control J to join them into a frame, so now I can move the frame around, and then I'll select the frame and hit F2 to add a label, and I'm just going to call this mapping. So now let's change the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 6, I'll turn the detail up to 10 so it's pretty detailed, and I'll turn the roughness up to like a 0.7. Now I want to distort this noise texture with another texture, so I'm going to duplicate the noise texture and drop it here, so it's going through the vector, so it's going to distort the noise texture. And then we'll change some of the settings of this noise. So for this one, I'm going to turn the scale to 5, I'll keep the detail at 10, and I'll turn the roughness up to like a 0.8. Now I want to control how much of the noise texture is distorting the first noise, so I'm going to search for a mix color, and I'll put this between the two noise textures. And I'm going to unplug the noise texture, and we're going to take the factor, and I'm going to put that into color B, and then I'm going to take the mapping vector, and I'm going to put that into color A. Now I have this factor which I can control to control the distortion, and I want to take the mix type here and change it to linear light, and that way it's not going to move the texture around as much, but it's still going to distort it. And I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.06, so it's just distorting it a little bit. So let's just compress these nodes, and I'll select them and join them into a frame, and then I will add a label, and I'll just call this rubber because this is the main rubber texture. And this texture is actually going to be going into the roughness value to make some parts more rough and other parts more shiny to add some variation. So let's now put this into the roughness, so the noise texture factor can go into the roughness value, and I can Control Shift select the principal shader, and then here on the base color, let's make it fully black so it's a black rubber. So if I zoom in here, kind of look at the reflections, you can see other parts are more rough and more shiny, but I want to control the roughness values, and I want the rubber to mostly be pretty rough. So let's go to the add menu. We're going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to put the color ramp between the noise and the principal, and we'll use the color ramp to change the roughness values. So if I click on the black tab and make it lighter, you can see everything's going to be more rough. So what I'm going to do is make it a light gray, and I'm going to put this tab kind of over here, and then I'll bring the white tab over to about here so it's a bit more contrasty, so you can see the variation. And for the light gray, this is going to be a hex value of C7, 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 FF. And then this other one here, this is just going to be fully white, so make it fully white. So now we're going to be creating another texture up here, which is going to be some little tiny scratches over the rubber. So to do this, I'm going to search for a magic texture. We'll drop it here, and I'll Control Shift select the magic texture, preview it, and then let's use the same object coordinates. So the mapping is going to go into the vector of the magic. And we'll change the depth up to 5, and then I'll turn the distortion here all the way up to 5 as well, and this is what we're going to use to make the scratches. And then I'll turn the scale down to like a 2. So now I want to make it really contrasty, so just the lighter parts are going to show up, so there's just some scratches here and there. So I'm going to take this color ramp, and I'll duplicate it and drop it here, and then with the color ramp selected, I'll hit the backspace, and that's going to reset the color ramp. So I can now drag these two values together, and I'm actually going to flip them so it's mostly black, which is little bits of white. So just drag that over there and that over there. So now you can see where the scratches are just showing up in a few areas here and there, but it's mostly going to be black. So now I want the magic texture to be distorted similarly like we did with this noise texture so that the scratches look more noisy and random. So I'm going to select the noise texture and the linear light, and I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-D. So Ctrl-Shift-D will duplicate the nodes, but keep the wires plugged up, and then I'll press Alt-P, and Alt-P is going to bring it out of the frame. So let's now take the linear light result, and we're going to put that into the vector of the magic texture. And then I can select all of these nodes, join them into a frame, and I can add a label, and I can call this scratches. Now I want to change a few settings on the noise texture and the linear light. So for one thing, I want to make it a bit more distorted, so I'll turn this factor here to a 0.1 on the linear light, but then I want to change the noise settings because if I zoom in here, it just looks way too noisy. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 6, and I'll leave the detail at 10, but then the roughness here, I'm just going to turn it to like a 0.55, and now you can see the scratches just look a little bit noisy and random, but they don't look too rough. So now we have the scratches and we have the rubber texture, and so I want to put the scratches here into this color, and I want to make it so that the scratches are also adding to the roughness. So we'll drag these nodes back here, and let's go to the add menu, and to mix them together, I'm going to add a mix color. Let's Control-Shift select the mix color to preview it, and I'm going to put the color amp color into color A, and then I'm going to put this color amp from the scratches, and this color is going to go into the factor. Now I just want to add the light values, so on the mix type here, we're going to change this to lighten. Then I can drag this value here, color B, I can turn this up more and more, and you can see as I turn it up, the scratches are going to show it more. And for color B here, I want it to be a really light color, but not fully light. And here on color B, this hex value is going to be EC, 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 FF. So now this lighten result can go here into the roughness, so we'll replace it for the color amp, and I'll Control-Shift select the color amp to preview it. So now you can see here if I zoom up to one of the scratches, this here, color B, this is going to make the scratches more rough or more shiny. Now I also want to be able to control the roughness values, so I'll go to the add menu, and we're going to add a hue saturation value, and I'll put this between the lighten and the principled shader, and I can now drag this value around, and that's going to control the brightness and darkness of the color, and so that is going to control the roughness of the material. And then finally I want to add some values into the bump strength, so let's go to the add menu and we'll search for a bump node and drop this here, so the normal can go into the normal, and now we can take this noise texture here from the rubber and we're going to put that into the height value. So you can see now it's just making the rubber look a little bit noisy, but I'm going to turn it to a really small number here, so on the bump strength I'll turn this to a 0.04. So now it's very subtle, you can turn it up more if you want to, but I'm going to keep it more smooth. And then we're going to take this bump node and we're going to duplicate it and we're going to drop it here after the first one, so the normal can go through the normal, but we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So let's take the scratches color ramp here and we're going to put this into the height value. So now you can see as I turn this up, it's going to make the scratches look kind of bumpy, but again I want to be very subtle, so I'll turn it to a 0.02. You can turn up more if you want to, but I mainly just want the scratches to show up on the roughness just to make it a little bit rough and not too dented. So that is the finished smooth rubber material, so we'll now join it together into a node group. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll hit Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group, and I'll just drag the node group over here. Let's make it bigger, and then I can copy the material name and paste it here into the node group. Let's hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel, and if I go to the group tab, here on the group sockets, I'm going to rename this to shader because I like that better. So now we can add up all the custom values to the group input. So we'll first put the mapping scale into the extra socket, and then if I click on the scale, we want to be one value. So on the type here, we're going to change it to float. Then we're going to go outside the node group and we can turn the scale back to 1. So let's go back into the node group. The next values that I want to add is the color and the roughness. So we'll drag the group input right over here. Let's take the base color, put that into the extra socket, and then also the hue saturation value. We can put the value into the extra socket, and this is going to control the roughness. So we'll double click on this to rename it and just rename it to roughness. Now I also want to control the rubber distortion. So if I just drag the group input right down here, we have this linear light, and this is controlling the distortion of the base texture. So we'll put the factor into the extra socket, and I'll just rename that to rubber distortion. Then I want to control the scratches, so I'll drag the group input right up here, and let's take the magic texture scale and put that into the extra socket. And then this noise texture has the detail, and the detail value is controlling the detail of the scratches. You can see if I zoom in here and just turn the detail down, they look a lot more smooth. So we'll put the detail into the extra socket. Let's open this up and we'll rename them. So this one is going to be scratches scale, and then the other one here is going to be scratches detail. And then we also have this magic texture distortion value, so I'll put the distortion into the extra socket, and this one I'll name to Scratch's Distortion. And then I want to control the bump strength, so I'll drag the group input right down here, and this first one is just the noise, so I'll put this into the extra socket, and let's just call this noise bump strength, or you can call it rubber bump strength. And then also this bump here, this second one, that is just the scratches, so I'll put this one into the extra socket, and this one I'm going to call Scratch's bump strength. Let's hit the N key to close the side panel, and I'll drag the group input right back here, and we'll hit tab to go outside the node group, and now we can just review the final material. So we have the scale value to change the size of the material, then we also have the base color, then we have the roughness of the material, the rubber distortion, we also have the scratches scale. It's a little bit hard to see, but if I kind of zoom in there you can see it a little bit better. Then also the detail of the scratches, the distortion of the scratches, and then we have the noise bump strength and also the scratches bump strength. So this is going to finish it up for part 1 on how to create procedural rubber materials. So we've created these 2 materials in this video, and in the next video we're going to be creating these 2 next rubber materials. So when that video is released, you can find it with the link in the description or right up there on the end screen. And if you'd like to purchase these procedural materials and help support the channel, you can get those with the links in the description. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.